December 16th, 1985, 17:26 p.m. Midtown Manhattan, Sparks Steakhouse. The air in New York doesn't just get cold, it turns into a blade. On 46th Street, the smell of exhaust fumes and expensive cigars mixed with the metallic scent of impending snow. Paul Castellano, the Pope of the Gambino family, stepped out of his black Lincoln. He didn't hear the footsteps. He didn't see the four men in trench coats and Russian fur hats. He only heard the crack, 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 the rhythmic dry sound of semi-automatic fire echoing off the brick walls. As Castellano's blood pooled on the pavement, a few blocks away, in a darkened social club, John Gotti took a long drag of his cigarette. The dapper Don wasn't just killing a man, he was killing an era. But every crown taken by force comes with a debt paid in lead. To consolidate power, Gotti needed to erase the remnants of the old guard. He needed to eliminate Vic the Hammer Terranova, a loyalist hidden in a fortified brownstone in Brooklyn. Gotti didn't send a message. He sent 25 of his most disciplined soldiers. He expected a cleanup. He expected a phone call by dawn. Click. The lighter flicked shut in Gotti's hand. 25 men, Gotti whispered to his underboss, Sammy the Bull. If a mouse breathes in that house tonight, I want to hear it stop. But for the Gambino family, the nightmare was only beginning. To understand the massacre that followed, we have to look at the 3 days leading up to the night the streets of Brooklyn ran red. Gotti thought he was the apex predator, but he had forgotten that a cornered rat doesn't just bite, it rips throats. The first van pulled up to the curb at 02 a.m. Silence. Then the first scream. 3 days before the massacre, 79th Street Social Club. The room smelled of stale espresso and old leather. John Gotti sat beneath a dim yellow bulb, leaning over a map of a specific block in Bay Ridge. Vic Terranova wasn't just a soldier, he was a ghost with a high-caliber rifle. After Castellano's hit, Vic had retreated to a reinforced brownstone, a literal bunker disguised as a family home. He's got steel plates behind the drywall, Sammy Gravano reported, sliding a folder across the table. Bulletproof glass, sensors on the perimeter, and he's not alone. He's got his brothers and enough ammo to start a small war. Gotti laughed, a dry, rasping sound. I don't care if he's in the Pentagon. I want his head on a platter by Tuesday. Send the heavy hitters, the guys from the Bergen crew, 25 men, overwhelming force. This was the legend effect in motion. Gotti wanted to project an image of invincibility. If you went against the new king of New York, the earth itself would swallow you. The plan was simple. A multi-point breach. 5 teams of 5. Explosives on the rear door, distraction fire at the front, and sharpshooters on the rooftops across the street. The decision was made. It was a move of pure ego. Gotti could have waited, starved him out, or used a car bomb. But he wanted it to be a statement. He wanted the neighborhood to hear the sound of his authority. Make sure they know, Gotti said, his eyes cold as the Atlantic. No one survives. Not the guards, not the dogs, no one. What Gotti didn't know was that Vic Terranova had spent the last decade studying urban guerrilla warfare. He wasn't just hiding, he was hunting. As the 25 hitmen checked their weapons in a basement in Queens, Vic was in his dark kitchen, calmly sharpening a combat knife. The trap was set. The hunters were about to become the harvest. January 14th, 02:12 a.m., Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. The temperature had dropped to 12 degrees. A light fog rolled in from the Narrows, blurring the street lamps into ghostly halos. Joey the Blade Migliara, the lead enforcer for the hit, signaled his team. They moved like shadows, dark silhouettes against the grey stone. Thermals showing 3 bodies in the living room, Joey whispered into his radio. Target is likely in the basement or the reinforced panic room. Move in. The sound of the city was muffled. A distant siren, the hum of a refrigerator in a neighboring house, the crunch of frozen slush under boots, then the thud. The back door didn't just blow, it disintegrated. The shockwave shattered the windows of the houses nearby. The first team rushed in, HK MP5s raised. They expected chaos. They expected panicked men in pajamas. Instead, they found a house that was unnervingly silent. The air inside was thick with the smell of floor wax and ozone. Clear, shouted one hitman. "Clear!" echoed another from the kitchen, but it wasn't clear. Joey the Blade stepped into the foyer and felt a slight resistance against his shin. A tripwire, so thin it was invisible in the tactical light. Ting. A small metallic sound, the pin of a fragmentation grenade being pulled from a bracket inside the wall. Joey's eyes widened. He tried to shout, but the world turned into white heat. The hallway became a chimney of fire and shrapnel. 2 men were down instantly. The fortress wasn't just reinforced, it was rigged. Gotti's men had breached the perimeter, but they had entered the belly of a beast designed to kill them one by one. 02:25 a.m. inside the Terra Nova brownstone. The lights went out. Not just a blown fuse, Vic had cut the main line from the inside. In the pitch black, the hitmen's night vision goggles should have given them the advantage. But Vic had anticipated this. He triggered high-intensity strobe lights hidden in the molding. The hitmen were blinded, their retinas seared by the flickering white light. From the shadows, the hammer began to strike. Pop, pop, 2 shots. 2 more Gambino soldiers slumped against the wallpaper. Vic was moving through the walls, literally. He had cut murder holes between the studs, allowing him to fire from one room into another without ever being seen. "He's in the walls," someone screamed. "He's everywhere." In the street, the backup teams heard the gunfire and the screams. Panic began to seep into the professional hitmen. This wasn't a hit, it was a meat grinder. Joey the Blade, bleeding from his ear, crawled toward the stairs. He was a veteran of 20 murders, but he had never felt a fear like this. It was the fear of an invisible enemy. Back at the social club, John Gotti sat by the phone. It remained silent. The silence was a poison. Every minute that passed without a clear signal was a crack in Gotti's armor. Inside the house, the count was down to 18. 7 men were already dead or dying in the foyer, and Vic Terra Nova hadn't even broken a sweat. He was playing a game of psychological chess, and he was taking Gotti's pieces with surgical precision. 02:40 a.m., the 2nd floor. The remaining hitmen pushed upward. They had no choice. To retreat was to face Gotti's wrath, which was often worse than death. They moved in a tight formation, stacking on the staircase. "We get to the top, we toss the flashbangs and spray," Joey commanded, his voice shaking. "He can't kill us all." It was a classic mistake. In a narrow space, numbers don't matter, positioning does. As they reached the midpoint of the stairs, the wooden treads beneath them gave way. It was a trapdoor triggered by a hydraulic lever in the basement. 4 men fell through the gap into a pit lined with sharpened rebar, a medieval tactic used in a modern city. The sound of meat hitting metal filled the air. The screams were unbearable. From the top of the stairs, Vic Terra Nova finally appeared. He looked like a demon in the flickering light, wearing a gas mask and a heavy tactical vest. He didn't use a handgun. He used a Remington 870 shotgun. Boom! The lead hitman was blown backward, his body taking out 2 more men behind him. The staircase became a slide of blood and gore. "Tell Gotti," Vic shouted over the roar of the chaos, "that he sent boys to do a monster's job." The Gambino soldiers broke. The legendary Bergen crew, the men who ran the streets of New York, were begging for their lives. But Vic wasn't interested in mercy. He was interested in a message. 03:05 a.m., the lower level. The 5 men who had tried to enter through the basement found themselves in a labyrinth of laundry machines and storage crates. They thought they had found a blind spot. They were wrong. The basement had been flooded with 2 inches of water. As the hitmen waded through, a heavy iron door slammed shut behind them, locking with an electronic hiss. "We're trapped." Suddenly the water began to hum. Vic had rigged a high-voltage industrial transformer to the floor drains. He didn't even have to fire a shot. He flipped a switch in the kitchen above. The blue arc of electricity danced across the water. The men didn't even have time to scream. Their nervous systems simply shut down. They collapsed into the water, their bodies twitching as the current cooked them from the inside. This wasn't just a defense, it was a statement of absolute dominance. Vic Terra Nova was showing the Gambino family that his house was a sacred ground that could not be desecrated. Upstairs, Joey the Blade was the last man standing on the ground floor. He looked around at the corpses of his friends. The grand plan, the 25-man army, had been decimated in less than an hour. He realized then that John Gotti had made the ultimate mistake. He had underestimated a man who had nothing left to lose. 3:15 a.m. The kitchen. Joey Migliara found Vic in the kitchen. The hammer was calmly pouring a cup of coffee, his shotgun resting on the granite counter. The house was quiet now, save for the distant groans of the dying and the hiss of the electrical fire in the basement. "You're the last one, Joey," Vic said, not looking up. "I recognized your voice. We had drinks at the Ravenite once, remember? You told me about your daughter's graduation." Joey's hands were shaking so hard he almost dropped his pistol. "Gotti. He won't stop, Vic. You kill us, he sends 50 more. He's the boss now." "He's a suit with a loud mouth," Vic spat. "He killed Paul because he was greedy, not because he was a leader. A leader protects his people. Gotti just uses them as firewood." Vic moved with a speed that defied his age. Before Joey could pull the trigger, Vic had kicked the table into his shins and slammed his head into the refrigerator. Joey fell, his world spinning. Vic stood over him, but he didn't raise the shotgun. Instead, he pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. It was a ledger, a list of every bribe, every dirty cop, and every secret Gotti had kept from the commission. "I'm going to let you live, Joey. Not because I like you, but because someone has to tell the story. Someone has to carry the warning." 04:30 a.m., Manhattan, the Ravenite Social Club. John Gotti was pacing. The sun was beginning to peek over the East River, but the shadows in the club felt heavier than ever. The phone finally rang. Sammy Gravano picked it up. His face went pale. He looked at Gotti, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What?" Gotti barked. "Is it done?" "No," Sammy whispered. "It's Joey. He's outside." Gotti pushed past him and threw open the heavy wooden door. There, standing on the sidewalk, was Joey the Blade. He was covered in blood, none of it his own. He was shaking, his eyes vacant, staring at a point 1,000 miles away. In his hand, he held a blood-stained burlap bag. "Where are the others?" Gotti demanded, grabbing Joey by the lapels. "Where is the rest of the crew?" Joey didn't speak. He simply dropped the bag at Gotti's feet. It didn't contain a head. It contained 24 sets of pinky rings, the signature jewelry of the Gambino soldiers. Each one was twisted and scorched. "He said—" Joey's voice was a ghost of a whisper. "He said that New York belongs to the shadows, John, not to the lights. He said if you ever send another man to his door, he won't send the rings back. He'll send the secrets." The dapper Don felt a chill that the January wind couldn't account for. For the first time in his life, John Gotti felt the floor shifting beneath him. 1 week later, the streets of South Brooklyn. The silence in New York is never truly silent. It's just a pause between screams. But in the week following the massacre of 4th Avenue, the silence felt heavy, like a shroud draped over the 5 boroughs. The story didn't just spread, it mutated. In the backrooms of social clubs from East Harlem to the piers of Staten Island, the Bergen crew was no longer spoken of as Gotti's elite vanguard. They were spoken of as ghosts. 25 men had marched into a residential block in Bay Ridge under the cover of darkness, and only one had returned to tell a story that sounded more like a fever dream than a tactical report. John Gotti's reputation for invincibility didn't just crack, it shattered like cheap glass. In the underworld, perception is the only currency that matters. If you can be beaten by one man in a house, you can be beaten by anyone. The commission, the High Council representing the heads of the 5 families, called a sit-down that felt more like a funeral for Gotti's authority. The air in the meeting room was thick with the smell of espresso and the unspoken scent of betrayal. "He lost 24 made men in a single night," Vincent Chin Gigante remarked, leaning back in his chair while wearing his signature bathrobe, a calculated mask of eccentricity. His voice was a low rasp that carried the weight of decades of violence. "That's not a boss, that's a liability. You don't send a battalion to kill a ghost and come back empty-handed. It's bad for business. It's bad for the brand." The pressure on Gotti began to mount from all sides. The FBI, alerted by the seismic shift in the criminal underworld, and rumors of a mass casualty event swarmed the Bay Ridge area. They brought forensics teams, dogs, and search warrants. They expected a charnel house. Instead, they found a void. Vic, the Hammer Terra Nova, had moved with a terrifying professional efficiency. The brownstone had been scrubbed with industrial-grade chemicals. The floors were waxed, the walls were patched, and the basement, once a site of electronic execution, was bone-dry and empty. Even the bodies had vanished, whispered to have been dissolved in acid or buried deep beneath the foundations of the new skyscrapers rising in Manhattan. Vic had become the boogeyman of the mafia, a legend used to keep younger soldiers in line. The Hammer didn't just survive, he retired into the fog of history, leaving behind a warning that remained carved into the very architecture of Gotti's mind. Every time a door creaked or a light flickered at the Ravenite social club, Gotti's hand would instinctively drift to his waistband. The price of power was rising, and for the first time the dapper Don realized he was running out of currency. He was king of a hill that was rapidly turning into a grave. The streets were watching, and they were waiting for him to stumble again. Present day, St. John's Cemetery, Queens. The rain in Queens falls with a particular kind of grey persistence, washing over the marble headstones of the men who once thought they owned the world. Years after that bloody night, John Gotti would finally succumb to cancer in a federal prison hospital, a shadow of the man who once strutted through Manhattan in $2,000 Brioni suits. He died in a cage, surrounded by the very walls he tried to build around others. But while the man died, the story of the 25 hitmen lived on, becoming a permanent stain on the Gambino legacy. If you go to the old delis in Bensonhurst or the dimly lit bars in Ozone Park, you'll still hear the old-timers whispering. They don't talk about Gotti's trials or his flamboyant ties. They talk about the night the Hammer struck back. They say that on the coldest January nights, if you walk past that specific brownstone in Bay Ridge, the air feels different. The streetlights seem to hum at a frequency that vibrates in your teeth. Some swear they can still hear the faint, rhythmic clack-clack of a shotgun being racked in the darkness, followed by the metallic smell of ozone and burnt copper. The moral of this dark chapter in American history is simple, yet brutal. Power is never a gift. It is a high-interest loan. And when you attempt to take more than your share through ego and blood, the universe has a way of collecting the debt. Gotti wanted to be a king, a Caesar of the concrete jungle, but he forgot the fundamental law of the streets. A king is only as strong as the men he leads, and as safe as the enemies he respects. He sacrificed 24 loyal soldiers on the altar of his own vanity, and in return, he received a haunting that lasted until his final breath. As for Vic Terra Nova, his fate remains the ultimate urban legend. Some say he fled to the rugged mountains of Sicily, living out his days as a simple farmer who keeps a loaded Remington 870 under his bed. Others believe he never left Brooklyn at all, that he's still there, a silent sentinel in a different window, watching the new generation of kings rise and fall, waiting for the next one to forget that the shadows always have the final say. The names on the social club doors change. The suits get more expensive. The technology gets faster. But the rules of the game remain written in lead and loyalty. John Gotti learned that the hard way. He thought he was the one holding the hammer, but in the end he was just another nail. The streets remember, the streets always remember. Was Gotti's ego his ultimate downfall, or was it inevitable in the world of the Cosa Nostra? Would you have stayed in that house like Vic, or would you have run before the first van arrived? Let me know in the comments below. If you want more deep dives into the shadows of criminal history, hit that like button and subscribe. The story doesn't end here, it just changes faces.